Welcome, everyone. This is Richard Eidlin, the coordinator of the Business Response to Authoritarian Threats, which is an initiative of the Horizons Project based in Washington, D.C. I want to thank you for joining this important conversation on the risks that crony capitalism poses to our democracy. And today's webinar and conversation is really about the shape and condition that our political economy in the United States currently finds itself in, with a particular focus on the relationship between the government and business. And when we say government, we're particularly interested today in talking about the Trump administration's set of practices and policies in directing and influencing economic policy. But we're also equally interested in understanding how business, particularly large businesses, are interacting with the administration and how together the two seem to be in a dynamic where certain industries and certain companies are benefiting from a set of policies. Phineas, we can go to the next slide. The conversation today is about crony capitalism and how that is an economic system in which individuals and businesses with political connections and influence and access are favored through a variety of government policies in ways that tend to suppress open competition in a free market. The United States, obviously, as the world's leading free market economy, with 347 million people, a $30 trillion budget, has always had incidences of cronyism where well-connected individuals and businesses tend to curry favor to gain a competitive advantage in the marketplace. But the question that many, both on the right and the left, are asking today is, are we reaching a new level of, of cronyism within the current administration? Next slide. There is, again, this is a quote: if there's one thing that populists on the left and right can agree on, it's a disdain for crony capitalism. And that is because programs and policies where there may be a play to pay element, possibility of self-dealing, selective regulatory enforcement, erratic policies, particularly around tariffs, maybe pandering to donors or giving pardons to donors, government ownership, all lead to a question about the stability of the economy, but also tends to undermine the public's trust in the workings of our democracy and our political system. So cronyism does, in fact, present serious costs and downside to many businesses who don't have access or connections to policymakers. And that particularly affects small and mid-sized companies. Next slide. So these are some headlines from the news over the past 2 months or so. And I'm sure you've been following many of these examples where the Trump administration has threatened a variety of companies, retaliating against companies and trying to get them in line to support administration policies. There's also, next slide, Phineas, a whole series of companies that are occurring in favor with the administration to stay out of their crosshairs, to gain access to new business opportunities. And that is a two-way street. We find both the government putting pressure on companies and businesses seeking to minimize the pain that they might suffer if they're not compliant with the administration, seeking to curry favor. Next slide. Actually, that is all the slides, I realize. But I did, before we get going, I wanted to thank the co-hosts of this program, including Principles First, the Center for Political Accountability, and Integrity Matters. The issue of cronyism and corruption is growing in concern. Again, as I said, from the right and the left, but it's also, I should note, being exacerbated by the absence of adequate congressional oversight and by the dismantling of the Inspector General system. So, with all that in mind, let's begin our conversation with our four panelists, and I'm really happy to have them all join us today. I'll quickly introduce them and then we'll get going with the conversation. So, Thomas Berry is with the Cato Institute. Thomas is the director of the Institute of Constitutional Studies, and Thomas is based in Washington, D.C. Jeff Smulyan is based in Indianapolis and is the CEO of Emmis Communications, which is a media holding company, particularly working in the radio industry. Elizabeth Doty, based in California, is the president and founder of Third Side Strategies, which helps companies assess risk and gives them some strategies and tools to determine how best to proceed in a political environment. And Robert Maguire from CREW, the Citizens for Responsibility of Ethics in Washington, is their senior research director. So, Thomas, let me start with you. And we've had this conversation a number of times over the years about what is cronyism, whether this is unique to the United States, and if not, how is it manifesting in the U.S.? And is the definition that I showed on the screen a little earlier, is that an adequate one?
Yeah, I think the definition is pretty good. I would say maybe we could go even broader in terms of what could be crony capitalism. So often crony capitalism might look like sort of a quid pro quo where you're giving a benefit to a person or a company or a group that donated to you or is your political ally or helped campaign for you. But sometimes it's more amorphous than that. Sometimes it's really just a matter of friends and enemies. Sometimes it's just, helping them with no immediate expectation of return, but to form long-term relationships. I kind of think of it as sometimes blurring the lines between public and private sector, especially common when people move, perhaps become politicians after having been in the private sector, and they continue to treat their former friends or colleagues as if those politicians were still in the private sector. They continue to treat it more as deals and negotiations and allies rather than treating their new position as one where they need to treat everyone neutrally. So there certainly is a history of crony capitalism within the United States. You can go back to the Gilded Age, when there were some extreme, one might say, boosts, giving the government giving too much money to railroad companies, in particular, subsidies for favored companies and helping them to form essentially monopolies in the United States. Oftentimes, it will be justified on policy grounds as boosting infrastructure, but those claims are often dubious, in particular, why you need to pick some winners and losers rather than simply letting the free market decide which railroad companies will be successful. It's also the flip side. It's also sometimes punishing disfavored companies or companies that did not do enough to curry favor. That can be things like raising tariffs on disfavored industries or industries that did not lobby enough for the same amount of protection as other industries. It can also just be even person group by group or company by company. I'd encourage people. There's a surprisingly gripping four-part series, dramatic historical drama on Netflix right now about the assassination of James Garfield. And one of the main plot points is his vice president, Chester Arthur, was the collector for the port of New York. And you really see just how much cronyism was involved in that job, where they were essentially deciding who are they going to investigate, who are they going to slap tariffs on or slap duties on. And bizarrely, their salaries were as a percentage of the amount of duties they collected. So you had an extreme case of self-dealing where the incentives were to find as much violations and slap on as many tariffs and fees as the collectors could get their hands on, and they had a lot of discretion about who did they investigate more closely than others. You see it in today's era. I think sort of the successors for things like railroad subsidies might be things like sports stadium subsidies, a similar example where you have so-called justifications for infrastructure boosting the economy, but it always winds up with a few favored companies, given the benefit. And I also, as a libertarian, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention protectionism and regulations that are often justified as for the benefits of public safety, et cetera, but all too often are really to harm disfavored or entry-level startup businesses in an industry and protect the more established businesses in an industry. When you see things like so-called certificate of need laws that force new businesses to prove why the market needs them, when you see things like laws that prevent food trucks opening near brick and mortar restaurants, all too often these are sold as safety regulations, but in my view are another example of crony capitalism.
So, Thomas, you and your colleagues at the Cato Institute have been using this phrase, the slow unraveling of of free market capitalism.
Mhm.
And as it refers to the Trump administration at present, what is the concern that you have as you think about modern era, current era politics in 2026, maybe based on historical precedent?
Well, the concern is it feels like there isn't any party right now really representing the free market position. I mean, Republicans that used to at least give lip service to the idea of a free market capitalism as being the best for a strong economy and economic growth. But it feels like Trumpism or populism or whatever you want to call it focuses on different things. It views the world economy as a zero-sum game where there are winners and losers, and the only way for America to have growth is to punish other countries or to stop them from having as much economic growth. The focus on kind of mercantilist tariff-based policies is a real throwback to what I had and my colleagues had thought were discarded, failed economic ideas of the 1800s. That the world economy is a zero-sum game and a fight for scarce resources and so on. So it's definitely dismaying that it feels like Trump and the Republican Party and all of their dealings focus more on, I guess, trying to take the country back to sort of an idealized vision of 1950s industrialist America rather than just focusing on policies that help every country, a rising tide lift all boats, and promote whatever industries are going to have the most growth in this current era, not the industries that some nostalgic view thinks we should go back to.
Mhm. And one of the criteria of cronyism seems to be that what matters more than merit or capability is access to policymakers. And so when you think of this administration, do you see examples of that? And is the Intel deal or the government taking a stake in NVIDIA or any of the other strategic minerals company, is that an example where competence is the most important factor, or is it more about who has access to to the Commerce Department or the Treasury Department?
Right. I mean, access, and what would you put it? Paying tribute seem to be the coins of the realm right now. I mean, it's almost comical how each of these companies has to come with a gift, a gold-plated whatever. I mean, it's not just companies, but it's foreign policy now. You have the Nobel Peace Prize winner giving her medal to Trump and the hope that it would influence how he would treat her in Venezuela. It's somewhat absurd, but yes, you have again, it feels like Trump is acting as if he's still a business owner negotiating with other business owners and trying to form alliances rather than the president of the United States trying to form the best policy for the country as a whole. And what we see is that when you have this access and gift-based policy making, it's going to benefit the bigger companies. You can't, a small upstart chip maker isn't going to find its way into the White House, isn't going to be able to give an expensive gift to the president or survive a deal where they give the government a 10% stake. It's only the established companies that have the lawyers, the lobbyists, the resources, and just the capital to survive this level of volatility.
Right, right. Good, good. Let's leave that point there, and I want to bring Elizabeth into the conversation. And Elizabeth, we've spoken a good bit about the incentive system that encourages companies to participate in this type of cronyist economy or to resist. And there are a lot of factors that companies have to consider, and they have to calculate risk. So you, as an advisor to companies thinking through these challenges that Tommy just pointed out, what advice, insight do you have for business people about when to get involved, how to respond, what options do they really have in this political environment?
Great, gotcha. And let me take that in two parts. Thanks for the chance to join today. So the first part, thinking about the risks, and then going into options. Um, I really appreciate this contrast you and Thomas just talked about between deals and sort of the infrastructure or environment that you need in order to compete and win based on merit. And one of the biggest mistakes companies make, and I've been hearing some of the uh, after epilogues for deals that people have made with this administration or with prior administrations, honestly. And one of the biggest mistakes is looking at just that individual deal. Looking at, we will not be able to do this merger. That's often one of the moments. We are dependent on government contracts. We are dependent on literally access to the office buildings in Washington. And therefore, we have to play ball and show loyalty and pay tribute and really indicate respect for this administration's priorities, is the way I've heard people say it. But what that misses is two or three levels of accumulating risk and harm that may not affect you on this deal, but will affect your firm and affect the environment that is 70% of your returns, right? A huge portion of your success. So one of them is you're setting a precedent. And we've heard this in any deal when you have repeated rounds, the parties will come back when you show them what pressure you'll succumb to. So we saw this with some of the media companies where we've heard quotes, well, last time I got $6 million, let's see if we can, how much we can get this time. So if you don't handle it very carefully at the time and manage those precedents and the logic behind your actions, you're opening yourself up for Columbia University. You don't really have a deal.
Mhm.
The second one is this is not negotiations just between two parties. It affects your relationships with all the other stakeholders that drive your success or failure or growth or decline. And so when you make a deal or show that you are not focused on serving customers and creating value and rewarding employees for helping you do that or shareholders for investing in you, then you are likely to get backlash. We saw this with some of the companies that capitulated to pressure on their hiring and promotion practices that their employees and their customers. With Jimmy Kimmel, we saw this, right? So it's not negotiations, it's treaty building, it's diplomacy in a public environment. And you'll bear some of the brunt of that. And you need to consider those stakeholder relationships. And then the last one is how are you affecting the system you depend on? And this one is really difficult because under threat, and every company right now is making some very difficult calculations, small and large. One of them is how is what I do here going to affect the overall environment for competition? That's a big ask, right? I mean, I'm, I, people are paying hundreds of thousands in tariffs, and you're going to think about your, small business paying hundreds of thousands. You're going to think about the effect. But if you calculate the risk, assuming every business did what you're about to do, and then think about, is that going to help your business grow? And you realize there's an enormous risk here. The US has enjoyed enormous eras of growth and prosperity when things are based on competition in the marketplace. And we're all
So
part of keeping that or eroding it.
yeah, let me pick up on that final point, and I wrote down collective action. So we have a lot of self-interested parties seeking to minimize harm from the system that Tommy described as, very well represented in how the economy is now working. But there are lots of individual companies who can't really redress the problem on their own. So do you look to trade associations? Do you look to chambers? Who's going to, carry that ball for you? And I will note that, one of our co-hosts, um, Audrey Ruffey with Integrity Matters has been working particularly on this issue of tariffs and trying to build a collective voice. Uh, Tommy has worked through the Cato and other and conservative legal firm um, filing suit against the Trump administration for tariff violation and tariff policies. So how do you advise a company to think about working with others?
Well, one of the things I think if you want to make people feel discouraged is call it collective action. Like we all just go, how can we get the momentum here? We have a shared interest. When the system declines, we'll all pay the price, but that feels like a very heavy lift. And so I think the thing to do is to realize there are people, you have a shared interest, and there are groups already representing your shared interest.
Mhm.
You want to make sure that the voice of the health of the system of free enterprise, the system of impartial government and enforcement, that is represented in those who are speaking on your behalf already. So it's a slight reframe. And one of
Mhm.
those is, what is your chamber prioritizing? It may be time to go back to fundamentals. For example, you mentioned the inspector general system. Maybe what state chambers need to be doing is saying, we want impartial government that is fair. You can appeal to the values of the administration and the priorities, the state government's elected representatives. We want a system that's fair, impartial, that's pro-business, and therefore we need adequate monitoring and enforcement. We want
Right.
due process clarified. We want these things. Make sure that those priorities are included and effectively articulated by those already speaking on your behalf, the voice of
Right.
business in Washington or the state capitals.
Right. And by doing that, it takes some of the partisanness out of this conversation, conceivably, right?
It really does. And in fact, there's this enormous opportunity. I just saw that the tariff exemptions on PET plastic were accused of cronyism, somebody, and all of the representatives that are responsible for the Association for PET, the Chemistry Council, they're like, no, it wasn't us.
Hmm.
So there's a lot going on right now. And
Yeah.
so it doesn't need to be partisan. It just needs to be, as Audrey Ruffe's stories show,
Hmm.
Republicans, Democrats, Independents saying we need the environment so we can deliver opportunity and value. Help us do that.
Right. Right. And I think, again, to reflect on the Cato Institute's premise here that an effective market-based economy works on the basis of rules. It is principles-based. And I think, the challenges this administration is presenting kind of upends all of that. Um, and I like your idea about being fair and impartial. Um,
And that's the one, sorry, Richard, and you may need to go on over to Jeff because of the experience that you, really powerful story. But I would like to come back to this idea of rules and principles. I do think
mhm.
that is the essence of the real philosophical difference being enacted. And it is something that business can articulate effectively and apply really practically. And that's one of the tools I'll share later. But
Great.
I just want to flag that I'm not going to go into that right now, but I think it's really important.
Okay, good. And I think that's really important. And for the audience, as we go forward thinking about strategies to address this challenge and this problem, adoption of and promotion of rules and principles is really critical. And I think allows us to have a more formidable conversation and push back on some of what we see, that seems immoral or possibly illegal. Um, Jeff, let me bring you in here and just give a quick background. Jeff's company, Emmis Communication, was operating in Hungary and throughout Europe in the 2000s. And in 2009, Jeff, if I have my date correct, recently elected Prime Minister Viktor Orban nationalized the company, took the assets, and distributed them, as I understand, to his cronies, who had been his allies in moving him through the political process. And
Right.
so Jeff has a very interesting story about how, a worst case scenario that he experienced happened, and hopefully, what lessons we can learn. And ideally, we're not going in that direction in the United States. But Jeff, give us a little bit more detail on what happened with your firm, please.
Richard, interestingly enough, we made the decision to invest in Hungary because after the fall of the Soviet Union, most of the countries in the European Union or in Eastern Europe decided they wanted to emulate the United States. They actually studied our FCC rules. We said what would allow us to invest is a rules-based system. where capital would flow, where you had some predictability, like we had in the United States. That was the system. Standards were set up, modeled after our own FCC. We won a national license. There were two national licenses. The radio network became gigantic. I think in a country of 10 million people, we had 4.5 million listeners a week. It was a very big station. I think that's why we were blindsided. We had heard about Orban. We were told that Orban had very bad relationships with the United States, and as an American company, we wouldn't have to worry about anything. Probably the single worst scouting report I've ever had in my life. And actually, what he did, even before he formally took over, is that he basically had people take over their Federal Radio Commission, rewrite the rules, change all the standards. So actually, what was fascinating is we were the first, and probably because we and the other national radio licensee, which was an Austrian company, were astounded at the demands, which is sort of like, give us editorial control, give us half your business. And we just thought it was, they were idle threats. And then what we realized is they rewrote the rules and basically took the licenses away. And somebody said to me, what's interesting is that they built a model based on, transparency, attracted capital based on rules based in the United States. And now we're going back and we said, gee, now the American system at our FCC is modeling itself after what they did in Hungary, which is frightening. But clearly, business needs predictability. Business needs to understand that there is a rules-based system under which you can live by. And obviously that was upended in Hungary. Now we're seeing it upended here.
Right. Right. As you think about the administration's involvement in a variety of media companies, TikTok, CBS, Paramount, et cetera, what do you see evolving here? Where are we heading?
Well, it's very simple. You're basically having an administration saying, this is what we want, and you do what we want, and you'll be okay. And we've seen it over and over. We saw it with the CBS purchase of, or the Ellis and Skydance purchase of CBS, where the leaders of CBS knew that they had to curry favor to get the deal through. And so they did certain things that everyone was shocked by in terms of the traditions of CBS News. You saw it with the Jimmy Kimmel case, where ABC quickly suspended him. Some of the other major companies, I was with one of the heads of one of the companies, and they knew that if they had actions in front of the FCC, that they either, and I think by the chairman saying, you either play ball the easy way or the hard way. And that's what happened. What's interesting about ABC is, and we know the people over there, I think the reaction to Kimmel was very swift from their viewers. They lost an awful lot of subscribers to Hulu, which they own, and Disney Plus and ESPN. I think that backlash is really what's helped them stop. But there's no question that if you look at, you have to look at the battle for Warner Brothers between Netflix and Skydance, Paramount. And it's sort of like, who can curry the most favor with the administration so we can win the deal? These are things we've never seen before. I've been in this business 50 years and nothing like this has ever occurred, but it's happening and it's happening every hour.
Yeah. Let me ask you sort of a two-part question. One, reflecting on what Elizabeth suggested about having a strategy internal to your company, having some common interests. And then the second part of the question is, given that we traditionally have relied on Congress to provide some oversight of these kinds of mergers and acquisitions and deal approvals, what is a company in the crosshairs to do if they don't want to play ball?
Well, that's the interesting thing, and they both come sort of the short answer that are you willing to do what's right? And you can look at members of Congress who privately say, in the Republican Party, who say this is lunacy, and then bend at the knee. And you see the same thing with companies where they say it privately, this is craziness. It's hard for companies, and I can sympathize. A company says we're going to have a $10 billion merger and acquisition, and it's important to us to get through it. And this is what we have to do. you'd hope that more people would say, is this right? Some people are starting to say that. I keep telling my wife that you're starting to see bricks come out of the wall, and at some point the wall collapses.
Mhm.
But clearly, what you've seen is people saying, I'm not going to do the right thing. I'm going to do the expedient thing.
Mhm.
That's painful, but you see that a lot.
Right, right. And is there a role for trade associations and chambers to play in advocating for a more rules-based system?
I think there is, but I think they tread lightly too, because I'm also a trustee of my university, and there's a part of everyone who says, I just want to keep my head down and stay out of the line of fire, whether that's
Mhm.
a trade association or a university board. It's frightening. It's like nothing we've ever seen, but until you see enough pushback, it's hard to get people to have the courage to stand up.
Right, right. Okay, good. Let's leave it there and we'll return to some of those themes in a moment. Robert, good afternoon. Good to see you there. And
Likewise.
so, Robert, Crew focuses a lot on corruption, has a corruption tracker, has been following government excesses for many years, and also I know has a crisp analysis on what cronyism is and the how money, uh, particularly political contributions, make a big impact on the behavior of elected officials. So, as you're thinking about this conversation and the work of Crew, um, does this situation we're in now seem markedly different from what we saw, 5, 6, 8 years ago? Are we at some new apex here?
Absolutely. So to give that some context, I mean, I want to step back and say, I've been in this field for 15 years now, and I spent the first several years that I was in it explaining to reporters and to the public and to people on the Hill that a lot of what we were talking about when we talked about corruption in America was what's called systemic corruption, which was basically the system was weighted in favor of people who had the resources to spend large amounts of money on politics. And what that meant was not that they went in with bags of cash in sort of late 19th century style and said, you do this and I'll give you this money. It is they have enough money to go to the fundraisers that they need to go to get FaceTime with the people who are powerful enough and who are making decisions to let them know what is sort of on their wish list, what the things that they need, the things their industry needs. And the members of Congress and the presidential candidates and the presidents themselves knew that they needed those donors on their side. And so they repeatedly had those conversations that, members of Congress spend 30 to 70% of their time dialing for dollars, and they're dialing the people who have the resources to give this money. So there's this whole system that predates Trump that was very clearly weighted in favor of people who have the resources to give large political contributions. And Trump certainly swims in those waters. But it's honestly hard to even encapsulate or describe just how fundamentally different he is. It's almost not crony capitalism anymore. It's just crony corruption. It's just straight up. There is no market anymore. He is the market. You go through him. And honestly, in a strange way, January 6th was the first indicator for us of how weak corporations were in the face of challenges to the way that the system was set up. And that's because in the days and weeks after January 6th, we started to see a large number of companies begin to make statements about not contributing anymore or reevaluating or taking a break or whatever from any of the 147 members who voted not to certify the 2020 election. Some of them said just all members of Congress. Some of them just said the 147 members. And we immediately thought, as soon as this calms down, some of these companies are going to come back. So we created a database. We started to pull FEC data. And sure enough, within a few months, corporations started coming back and started giving contributions to these members of Congress. And our aim here was not some sort of just a gotcha, you guys are liars or whatever. The message here was that companies, just as Elizabeth said earlier, when she mentioned that they're focused on this next deal, that companies are so focused on their short-term interests and not on the long-term interests they have in stability, in rule of law, in democracy. And from our perspective, they just fundamentally do not understand that they are undermining their long-term interests and their ability to do business, to use the legal frameworks that they use to be able to plan their finances for the short-term interest of getting access and influence to powerful people. And and that has, again, under Trump, it has taken this turn that is because everything that predates Trump is they're giving to campaigns, they're giving to super PACs. The Supreme Court has whittled away the limits on how much wealthy interests can give, and so they've been giving, but they're not directly enriching people in power. Now they are, and it's infecting every aspect of the president's prerogatives. So you have instances where he's dropping criminal cases, or his administration is dropping criminal cases. So you have, Justin Sun invests $75 million into Trump's crypto venture, and the SEC investigation is paused. Just today, NBC put out a report showing that over half the pardons Trump made were for white-collar offenses. And in many of those instances, there's documented proof that people made payments to ingratiate themselves, either through lobbying for those things or investments in some of Trump's businesses. You have reports, a public citizen report from last week of 145 canceled enforcement actions against 153 corporations, many of whom have given to not only to Trump's political committees, but to his inaugural committee, to his, some of them have made these outlandish settlements, legal settlements, paying for his ballroom. Then you have the selling of pardons. In one particularly egregious instance, you have a $2 billion investment from Binance channeled through Trump's World Liberty Financial. $2 billion. And months later, CZ Zhao gets a pardon from Trump. And then you have Trump's physical businesses, which were the sort of nexus for his corruption in his first term, and are less so now, but they still are bargaining chips. So, for example, he has a development in Vietnam. He's also, as president, put tariffs on Vietnam. And we see the Vietnam property getting fast-tracked, getting special treatment from the government as sort of a bargaining chip for Vietnam to come to the table and get special treatment on tariffs.
Right.
And I could go on and on. I'll just mention the one last one. We also, Trump's largest donor for the first few months of this year, Elon Musk, largest donor in 2024, and basically as a gift, he was given basically the ability to run roughshod over the federal government for the first few months of 2025. It was completely lawless, and it was, largely due to the fact that Elon had given him hundreds of millions of dollars and gotten him back into office. So there is absolutely, I don't know if there's any comparison in terms of magnitude, in terms of money, of what Trump is doing compared to any past president.
Okay, that's a pretty convincing argument you just made. Thank you. So, with that critique that Robert just offered, I wanted to sort of move the conversation to what actions, what responses might the presenters have as far as how the broader business community can advocate for reform. And I think that the key question is that we might ask, is this arrangement that Robert has just described, is this fair? Or as Elizabeth and Tommy suggested, is this beneficial to our long-term interest as a country? And as Jeff suggested, is this beneficial to the broad consumer that has some say in this process too? So as we think about protecting the health of our democracy while maintaining a free market economy, Tommy, let's start with you. What specific recommendations, might you have to those small, mid-sized businesses that want to engage, what recourse do we have to push back on some of what Robert was just describing?
Sure. My own personal focus is on the courts, so that's what I know best. A lot of these actions of protectionism or cronyism are not just bad policy, but they're often, in my view, illegal, particularly in cases where the president is acting unilaterally and sort of changing his views at a whim. The Constitution doesn't give the president any inherent power to do that. You have to be acting pursuant to a statute. And if you dig into the legal justifications, quite often the claim of authority that the president is using is pretty tenuous. In my view, that's what's occurring with the tariffs. Trump has invoked IEPA, the International Economic Emergency Protection Act. Uh, and in my view, if you look at the text that they're relying on, it simply doesn't authorize tariffs at all. Congress knows how to give the president authority to issue tariffs, but Congress also knows what a heavy dose of medicine that is, and how dangerous it would be to give the president that authority without any guardrails, which is why the statutes that do give a tariff authority either lay out exactly what the levels will be or set a cap, like the most well-known other statute sets a cap of 15% in 150 days maximum for certain emergency tariffs. So multiple lawsuits were brought against the Trump administration challenging these tariffs. And what's notable is that the plaintiffs, the parties named in the cases who are actually being represented, are all small businesses. None of them are the big ones you've heard of that have the capacity to get deals or get some favoritism from the administration. They're companies who faced an existential risk because they're often small, just run by two, three, or four people, not enough, capital on hand to survive this level of volatility or uncertainty, and relying on imports for most of their businesses. VOS Selections is a great example. The lead plaintiff in the case that went up to the Supreme Court, a small wine importer that imports basically all of its wines from Europe. Its business model just would not survive under the current tariffs. And I think what probably a lot of businesses don't know is that you don't need to pay for expensive lawyers to bring these challenges. There are nonprofit law firms, public interest law firms, with the goal of changing policy for the better, of striking down unconstitutional actions. Not probably, the most famous one is the ACLU, but there are many more besides that, many focus specifically on economic issues. So my former employer, the Pacific Legal Foundation, brought one of these lawsuits. The New Civil Liberties Alliance, which we frequently support their cases with amicus briefs here at Cato, they brought another lawsuit. And Liberty Justice Center, which we also worked closely with, brought another of those lawsuits. So I'd encourage small businesses that are interested in doing their part, being willing to be a public face of a challenge to the administration, reach out to groups like this. Institute for Justice is another. If it's a free speech issue, Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE, with something like the Jimmy Kimmel case or others like that. Look for nonprofit public interest, maybe free market. Washington Legal Foundation is one that focuses a lot on businesses. Look for those, and they are very, very interested in finding more plaintiffs to bring more lawsuits.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Jeff, let me ask you, based on your description and you telling your wife that the bricks are beginning to fall, and yet the problem that many companies have about thinking long term, or they're not thinking long term and because they're focused on the short term gain, what advice would you have for, senior executives in companies in the C-suite?
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
I think people have to speak out. I see that more and more. I live in a state where I'm sort of historically a Democrat, but I have a lot of Republican friends, and they're starting to say enough is enough. I believe, as Tom said, the primary recourse is through the courts, but the most significant recourse is at the ballot box. And I think I'm seeing enough people. I just saw one of the polls that said, well, the economy is the number one issue. Threat to democracy is second, which really encouraged me because we always say that people will change when they go to Walmart and they pay $20 more. But I think it's sinking into a lot of people. These are real threats to democracy. And listening to all of the things that have occurred, you can't keep up with them. And I think it's going to require people to be courageous and stand up. And I'm seeing it more and more from average people, business people are saying, look, and a lot of them said, I voted for him. I always say, I have a lot of my friends, well, they vote, for the Republicans because they'll save 4% of their taxes. But I see a lot of people like that. I call them country club Republicans who say, this is deeper than that. This is more important. And I have to think long term about my future and my family's future. So I'm sort of an optimist in the sort of shorter long term that things are going to change.
Good, good. Robert, when you think about, the challenges that lie ahead and your own critique, where do you think the greatest leverage point is for small and mid-sized companies? Is that in advocating in Congress? Is that pushing for the reinstatement of inspector generals? Is that pushing large companies to stop contributing money to candidates? Where do you think we should focus the effort here?
I certainly think those things. I mean, first, I would point out, we in late 2020, we put out a long report called What Democracy Looks Like. There's a whole slate of legislative changes and policy changes in there that are still relevant today. I would also second what Tommy said about nonprofit lawyers being there to help. We brought the emoluments case against Trump in the first term. We are always looking for plaintiffs for cases that are relevant to the Trump's corruption in particular. But as Tommy mentioned, there are a number of other organizations that have expertise in other areas that are relevant to small businesses and large businesses alike. I absolutely think that our entire campaign finance system needs to be overhauled, that the outsized influence that both people and corporations have solely as a result of the financial resources they have at their disposal is not the way that we should be running elections and funding elections. But in the meantime, we are in the awkward position of saying those who do have those megaphones, namely the large corporations, and collectively small business groups, should be using the megaphone that they have as a result of having those resources to understand that their long-term ability to be able to do business is tied up in fighting back against the lawlessness and corruption of this administration. That includes things like protecting IGs. One of the first on Trump's first day in office, he fired 17 inspectors general. He's fired, or 10 more have either been fired or left since then. These are people who protect taxpayers from waste, fraud, and abuse. I believe in 2023 alone, they saved taxpayers on the order of $93 billion. And they are not expensive either. We're talking about a handful of IGs that do amazing work in our government to hold accountable the people who are spending the money. And more generally, we need to protect the civil service. We need to make sure that the government is full of people who are there to follow the law and the Constitution, which is the oath they take, and not be loyalists to the president. And lastly, I think we're going to need, and this is probably not something that's going to happen in this Congress, but hopefully in the next Congress, there can be a large HR1, some sort of omnibus bill that looks at all of the things that have been done in this first year and finds ways to protect against it. But fundamentally for the business community, there has to be some sort of collective realization and collective action that their business, their ability to do business is at stake.
Right. Good. Thank you. Thank you. Elizabeth, I know you wanted to highlight, some thinking around what you're calling moments of truth. And I know you had some slides. Do you have access to
Yeah,
those?
but I think I want to move on. I will
Okay.
mention the moments of truth, but I want to
Okay.
move on to what I said earlier about this. I know it doesn't seem clear that so much of the action is external, trying to address the issues in the institutions and the law, and there are things companies can do internally to help themselves rebalance towards that longer term actual self-interest. So can I focus on that as a
Sure.
start?
Yeah. And we have, we just, we have like 3 minutes, 2 minutes or so.
Okay. Great. So I want to talk about first that one of the things we learn from other environments, experts in Chile, Argentina, Egypt, is that I've just been talking to, is to anticipate the pressure your specific company may be under. Like Jeff, you talked about being blindsided by the ways that, the astounding demands or threats. To anticipate these moments of truth where your organization will be on the firing line, or people in the organization will be on the firing line, and having to make a decision. And so one of the things you need if you're going to anticipate the pressure is an internal policy for how you will make decisions, especially trade-offs that may, for example, get you a tax break now, or non-enforcement of fossil fuel emission standards, or if you're MIT, having special government funding if you comply with greater government involvement in your curriculum. Instead, to have a policy and the guidelines and frameworks you need to internally clear about how you will weigh those trade-offs. The way to think about it in terms of courage is there was an investment manager in Houston who lost clients because he refused to invest in Enron. That's the kind of decision we want to support people in making. And one of the best ways I think to do that, Robert and Jeff, what you talked about, is to involve more people and be clear about your goals for your public affairs activities, where you will refrain and where you will engage. Will you do spending? Will you not? And so we've created this tool, and are you able to see now the crafting your public affairs engagement policy? We've created a website called the CPR Hub, and the main toolkit there is a guide to crafting your own or updating your public affairs engagement policy to make sure it reflects your long-term interests and values, to make sure that you have principles for making decisions. And I think right now, the biggest trick will come from improv skills of linking to you want to serve your shareholders, you want to create value, you want fair processes based on merit and capability. Put those in writing, that is the basis you will use rather than loyalty or threat.
Okay.
And then talk about how you will take action. In this case, you may want to adopt the CPA-Zicklin framework, that you will consider the impacts of your activities, and you may become a non-spender because it's just too fraught for shakedowns. So make sure your actions are aligned. Look at how you will communicate, and we've got some examples of third side, nonpartisan, and how you will monitor this over time. So this is something you can do internally that will then guide and allow you to prioritize working through your chamber, working through the legal opportunities in advance of those pressures, because you have a pretty active system right now looking for targets. And that's one reason to do this proactively. So hopefully that was fast enough.
Yep, it's great. Good, thank you. And I just put a reference to the Zicklin Index in the chat.
Can you
So
also put the link to the toolkits that I had shared with you? Do you
yes,
need to do that? Okay.
if you have those, if you wouldn't mind doing that, if
I
so,
will.
I will try to find those as well. But I just wanted to, with just our few minutes left here, um, if you look at the results here, so 32% of the respondents here in this poll feels it puts them at a competitive disadvantage, cronyism and corruption. And then I think it's also significant that, a number of people makes them hesitant to oppose administration policies because I guess the rational fear of retribution or retaliation. So, that is real. Um, and 100% that cronyism is greater in this current administration than anything in previous times. And then, who can most effectively push back on cronyism? I think everyone just answered that in the panel. So it's somewhat evenly divided. And I think for those of you who belong to chambers, making this argument that, I think all the panelists highlighted that long-term economic health considerations are really critical. We need to drive that point home and move away from, narrow short-termism, which I think the administration is probably counting on. So chambers can make that case, trade associations in particular, but from my own experience with those organizations is it takes members of those organizations to advocate. They're not necessarily going to step up on their own. So thank you all for that. And Jeff, let me go back to you, ask if you'd like to, offer any final thoughts. Leading a publicly traded company, you are in communication with lots of other executives across the country, and what encouragement might you present to us?
As the optimist, I think things are going to get better. I think that the excesses are so significant that a lot of people who normally don't pay attention are paying attention. And I think as people pay attention, things change. So that would be my 30-second burst of optimism for this group.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. Elizabeth, Robert, Tommy, thanks so much. Phineas, thank you for managing the details behind the screen there. And if you're interested, folks, in learning more about the effort to address cronyism and corruption, please feel free to reach out to me. I will put my email in the chat here and would be happy to talk to any of you in the future. Good. So thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of the day.